Welcome everybody for the Firefighter Book Club. Today we're hanging out with Tom Dunne, when we're going to be covering his book, Notes from the Fireground. And I love this book for the nostalgia and kind of like looking at and even though we're all firefighters, there's a particular setting that for those that worked at the FDNY, and they definitely get a different perspective than I think most fire departments, and you really get to see it in Tom's book, which is really awesome. And I really a fun read for me. I'm going to be honest, I didn't get all the way till the end, so I still owe you some reading just because I was trying to get mine done. But that's kind of where we're at. So a few announcements to get started. The book next month is Frank Viscuso's new book. So started reading this one as well, Flashpoint. Really cool because a lot of the topics here line up with the new book that I'm writing right now. So I was really stoked to read Flashpoint. I've kind of started digging in just to kind of see what it's all about. But Frank will be here next month. Really excited about that. We still don't have a book for November. I'm working on, we're probably just going to reschedule the book that we were supposed to do from August while I was at FRI. It was going to be Tattoos and Trauma with David Griffin. Unfortunately, with the storms and all that, with flights out of FRI at Texas, we weren't able to hook up out there and get that one done. So we're probably going to try to reschedule David Griffin in November for Tattoos and Trauma. Most of you have already read it because it was the August book club. And then December, if I can pull it off, this is going to be like getting a bunch of clowns in the same circus tent all at the same time. But with my book getting published, it's like, well, who interviews me for my book? So I'm going to try to get as many of the contributing authors. No, David, you cannot interview me for my book. So I'm trying to get a couple of the contributing authors, and we had quite a few. So Mike Galliano, Steve Przybowski was in there, Anthony Castros. All these guys had contributing pieces in the case studies of the book. Chase Sargent did the forward. So I'll try to get the Bad Panda on here as well. But it'll be kind of a big thing. And if we can get that done in December, we'll probably do like a 2-hour meeting and try to like talk about employee fire strategy and tactics for employee fires from a perspective of all these guys. And I think it'll be a lot of fun. So I'm going to try to get that rounded off for the year. However, for the 2023 book club reading list, I'm still working on that. So if you have a suggestion, send me a PM through Facebook or go to the firefighterbookclub.com website, send me an email. If you have a suggestion, I'll review it, see if we can squeeze it in. I know that one of the books we've already got on there is Scott's The Functional Fire Company. I talked with him the other day. So I know we're going to get his book on the 2023 reading list. If you already have it, great. If you don't, then you can start purchasing that one. I want to try to get the 23 reading list out as soon as possible because I know there's certain times that we all get busy. And if you can kind of front load some of your reading so you're not on a timeline like I am with reading a book every month sometimes, I think the more we push it out forward in front of you, the easier it is. So like I said, if you have a suggestion for next year for 23, I will definitely take it. I think we've gotten to a lot of the major books that a lot of people wanted to read in the first 2 years we've been doing this. And now it's like, okay, what else is out there? So I'm looking for suggestions. So to officially start the meeting today, I'm going to turn it over to Chief Tom Dunne. So Chief, good morning.
Good morning, Jesse. First of all, as I said before, thanks so much for the invite. I really appreciate it. And to anyone who tunes in, I know right now we have Matt and David actually live online. I've listened to some of the book club meetings before, and I think you've created a great outlet for writers and firefighters and would-be writers. So it's great to be here. I do want to make one quick mention before we go into it. Because of the time of year, we're just a few days away from what will be the 21st anniversary of the 9/11 attack. And I find anytime I have a class or Zoom or meeting, anything of that nature this time of year, I always feel the need just to pause for 1 second. And I really recognize the fact that we're getting close again to that anniversary, and to pause for a moment just to remember not only the coworkers, the many men I worked with who are no longer here, but the countless civilians, police officers, EMS workers who we lost that day, and to remember the really hundreds or thousands of people, even today, who are suffering the physical after effects of that attack. So again, not to belabor the point, but given the fact that we're 2 or 3 days away from the anniversary, just to mention a few thoughts for those that we lost in the past and those that are continuing to suffer now. But again, thank you so much. I really appreciate the invite and the opportunity to talk about the book and firefighting or writing in general, whatever happens to come up in our conversation.
Well, I kind of like wanted to leave it open to interpretation and ad lib as we go, but
Sure. That's the best way to do it. That's
right. And you've actually been on not only just a book club meeting a couple times, but saw you on a writer's block meeting as well that we usually do after this. And we had kind of discussed it before the camera started rolling here, but you talk about in the book, you don't really consider yourself a writer. And in your writing, I don't see that. You're a great storyteller. I truly relished in like going through a lot of the stories because you really do a really good job of setting the stage and choosing the right words that that it's 5 sentences to describe the color and the shape of something versus just a word. And yeah, Tom, it was great. I think that you do a really good job with that.
Well, thanks. I think the writer label kind of snuck up on me because, again, if you were to wake me up at 4 in the morning and say, "What are you?" I'd probably say a retired firefighter at this point. I've had an opportunity to write. It was a challenge. Actually, 20 years ago, I wanted to write a technical article for fire engineering. And I banged it out. It was like 2,000 words, whatever it was back then. And I didn't even know if I could write an article. And here I produced this nice article. And fortunately, I had a photographer with some great photographs. And now 20 years later, I'm still writing the articles. And I think what happened with me, 2 things. I was writing technical articles, and I was doing a tremendous amount of studying for promotional purposes and to learn the job. So I have this heap of technical knowledge and somewhat dry technical reading that I wanted to get away from. I wanted to produce something that was just a little more creative. And initially, I envisioned the book as being a series of chapters of scenarios, experiences I had that would be followed up with lessons drawn from those experiences, sort of a fire engineering type of textbook. And I started that, and as I was working on it, I realized that's not really what I want to write. I've written enough technical junk at this point. I want to kind of tell civilians, people who don't know about the fire service, what it's like to be a firefighter, and maybe to let the firefighters who work in departments in other parts of the country get a sense of what the urban environment is like and some of the things that you go through. So I think a lot, perhaps, of what I talked about is common knowledge and common experience for a firefighter wherever you are, but some of it is peculiar to New York. And as far as becoming an author, I did find that the more I did it, the better I got at it and the more I enjoyed it. And I sort of started liberating myself from that somewhat structured technical writing to a point where, like I said, I could spend 2 or 3 sentences describing a sound or a color or something. And it led, as I mentioned before we started, soon this fall or next spring, I took it to the next step and have written a novel where the main character is a New York City firefighter. And there are certain, plot swings around that go through in the novel. So yeah, I guess I'm an author because when you produce 20 articles and 2 books, that makes you an author. But in my soul, in my heart, my mind, I'm still, I'm not sure I'm an author, but I guess I kind of got that label right now.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like sometimes it's I'm going to write a book. I'm just going to gather up all the articles that I've done and then just put, a staple in it. But yeah, this was a completely different venture for you. And it is different than a lot of the books we have been reading in the book club. We did do John Norman's Working with Giants, and it's very similar.
John's interview. Yeah, John.
Yeah.
John was an excellent guy and an excellent excellent officer, fire officer, and a really good author. So I was glad to see John's book get published because there's some really excellent stuff out there. I'm looking forward to seeing your book. But I like to see a little diversity as John's book reflects, and hopefully my book reflects too.
Yeah. Well, we, we were talking about before the before the camera came on, so I have the proof.
There it
And
is.
sometimes it's not what I say. I have the proof, like the proof copy of the book. I have the proof I've been writing one for 5 years. That's really what I call the proof. That I'm not just, yeah, I'm not just saying I'm writing a book. I actually have the proof that I've been writing a book for 5 years. So, yeah, really excited. So thanks for the pitch, but
I think of it as being a marathon. You know what? Let's say a magazine article or maybe preparing a fire lecture is a sprint where you're gathering your information, you're producing something that hopefully is interesting. Writing a book, and you've been through it now, it's a marathon. You know, I could not imagine producing 85,000 words about anything, you know, and yet if you break it down, if you're persistent, if you stay with it, it stays with you. I think if you look for inspirations, a lot of that comes from within. You know, everyone who's going to listen to this, yourself, Matt, David, all firefighters have these experiences, and they're ingrained in you, and they sit inside of you, and they ferment. And sometimes they're good experiences, sometimes they're bad experiences, but you draw from that, and that's kind of what I drew from. To some extent, to a great extent, I think my father was an influence. As I mentioned in the book, he was a New York City firefighter for almost 30 years. He was a lieutenant when he retired. And I don't think I ever even would have become a firefighter, you know, if it hadn't been for him, because it wasn't something that normally would come to mind living in New York City. Most of my friends in my neighborhood worked either office jobs in Manhattan or they worked in the local factories. And I remember as a kid seeing my father on a fire truck and going to a fire. And I remember thinking, wow, that's cool. You know, that's something I might want to try someday. And I did, with the intention of trying it for 1 year. I just wanted the experience of being a New York City firefighter. And then I turned around and 33 years had passed, and I had a whole career behind me. So my dad probably is the biggest influence in my becoming a firefighter. And as far as writing, I'd have to say a major influence is my wife, Suzanne, who is a novelist, who has now produced 9 or 10 novels. In fact, she started her first 3 novels. I was kind of the technical advisor for them. And she wrote the initial 3 novels about a woman who's a New York City fire marshal. So I kind of observed her writing from a distance and her perseverance in cranking these things out. So maybe those were the 2 big influences in my professional life in terms of becoming a firefighter and eventually becoming somewhat of an author.
well, and you kind of talk about it in the book where you said, well, I'm just going to try this firefighting thing out, see if I like it. But
Yeah.
where were you going before the hey, I'll go try the firefighter thing?
I was working for New York State. I was working a civil service job, and my job essentially was working with and for people who didn't have a lot. Mostly they were welfare clients. And my job was to produce jobs for them to get them on jobs. And it was a bit frustrating because if I worked with 10 people, maybe 1 or 2 were truly motivated to go out and get work. And the others, well, various problems. You know, some of them just couldn't get a job that made it worthwhile for them to get off of the welfare rolls because it just didn't pay enough. And maybe with the car fare involved, they would lose money. But I never really, even though in theory I was helping people, I was kind of bored with the job, you know, and I took the New York City firefighters test, again, based on basically my father's recommendation. He said, hey, they're opening up, you know, you might as well put the application in. And I thought, yeah, I guess I'll put the application in. Took it. It was very competitive. There used to be something like 30,000 people who would take the test. And then I kind of forgot about it. And a year or two went by, and out of the clear blue, I got a call, and then my name came up on the list. And I said, yeah, I jumped right into it with that mindset of, all right, this will be a new, exciting experience. I'll see what it's like. And that's kind of where I was at before and how I went into it. And I quickly discovered, as so many people in the fire service do, how fascinating the work was, how challenging it was, really how difficult it was. It was even though I was always athletic and physical, as you all know, it was a brutal job physically. You'd work in the snow and the cold and the rain and the hot summer, and you'd hump hose up 5 flights of stairs and then force a door. And I just loved it, from the beginning. I loved the work. The atmosphere of the firehouse was radically different than anything I had ever experienced. It was a tough alpha male type of environment, a little bit intimidating at first, but I had the opportunity when I came on the job of working with guys who were from the so-called war years in New York City, that period of time from the late 60s to about the early to mid 70s, where neighborhoods in New York City were burning every night. And these guys were doing unbelievable levels of fire duty. They would tell you stories where, forget about 15 or 20 runs a night, they might do 30, 35 runs a night, and half of them might be for structural fires. There were stories I heard of guys who in the South Bronx would leave one tenement fire and literally walk around the corner to go to the next tenement fire. So it was a great opportunity to work with guys who saw levels of activity that probably have never been experienced before, and hopefully will never be experienced to that extent in the future. And they were a tough bunch. They were the greatest firefighters in the world, but they were a rough, tough group of guys that many of whom slowed down to show me the ropes, and I always very much appreciated that.
Well, I think sometimes the war years are what embedded, your night shift and your day shift, where a lot of other fire departments are working 24-hour shifts. It's like, yeah, we were running fires all night. We just need 2 separate shifts, and it kind of embedded that. And you guys have been lucky enough to keep it, but yeah, I just get to stay up all night and then run calls the next day too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, and when you were coming in, obviously FDNY is a big place. Did you have many opportunities to work with your dad?
No, my dad had retired 5 years before I came on the job.
Okay.
And naturally, he was thrilled to see me come on the job. And he had the opportunity because I worked really hard to get promoted. I didn't care about the money. As you get promoted, you get more money, and naturally that affects a lot of good things in your life. I never cared about the money. I just was so much into the job. I wanted to learn and experience everything I could. So as much as I like being an engine firefighter, where I started, I transferred to a ladder truck company in Manhattan because I wouldn't experience that aspect of the work. Then the next logical choice opportunity was to study for company officer, for lieutenant, captain, battalion chief, deputy chief. So I had the opportunity to go through several ranks while he was still alive. And I know it meant a great deal to him to come to the promotional ceremonies and be able to see me get promoted to lieutenant, captain, and subsequent ranks. And no, I didn't work with my father, but periodically I would run into one of the older guys who knew him, who worked with him, one or two who actually worked with him in the engine company he was in Brooklyn that had been disbanded around 1975. So there definitely was that, that contact, that family continuity in the fire service.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the things that you actually brought up in your book. And sometimes you would think that, you're just bringing this small little world that nobody else sees from the FDNY out to this, you said the civilians, but really sometimes even firefighters, not every fire station has a pole. Not every fire station has even logbooks, definitely not ones that are dating back to 1890s
Yeah.
and things like that. So What you seem like sometimes like a very good historian, and you're able to take the history of the FDNY and kind of mold it into stories here. So, is there another story that you can kind of tell us about, like your findings as you kind of walked around between the wrapper and the log books and just the different firehouses?
Well, as a historian, I'm sort of a historian the way I am an author. I am and I'm not. My least favorite subject in school was history. And the reason for that was they taught it in the most boring manner possible. And to me, history, real fascinating history, was hands-on stuff. If I could pick up, let's say, a plow that some settler used in 1823, that to me is history. That's hands-on stuff. And I always had that sort of in the back of my mind, especially when I worked in some of the older firehouses in Manhattan, some of which would go back, to like 1850, 1860. And if you went down to the cellar, you could still see the stalls where the coal bins had been. In some places, you can kind of look to the side of the apparatus floor and see where the horses used to line up and just envision what that was like. Many of the architectural features of the buildings, if you look closely enough, were still there. You have these ancient cabinets that you had to climb up ladders to get in a loft place, and that's where I would dig up when I had spare time, dig up an old company journal. The one I mentioned in the book was from 1873, and I remember that particular story I talk about in the book. I was detailed to an engine company in mid-Manhattan, a different company I was normally assigned to, for one day, and dug up this page from 1873 that the house watchman had made entries in. And it was fascinating because, like I said in the book, 1873, there was no Brooklyn Bridge, okay? The guy who wrote those entries was probably a Civil War veteran. Ulysses S. Grant was the president, and Custer's last stand had not yet occurred. That was coming up in about 3 years. So I looked at that and I thought, wow, this guy wrote these entries, and now I'm sitting in what is probably the same house watch desk writing my entries. And it was kind of great connection to the past. And I couldn't take the book because that's the property of the company. But in the book, I mentioned the wrapper, which was a tobacco wrapper that he must have stuck in there in 1873 when he went on a run. And just about that time, a run came in for that company. So I took the wrapper and I remember wrapping it up carefully, putting it in my pocket, getting on the rig, and going through Manhattan traffic, all the noise and congestion. And I thought, wow, this is really cool and ironic. This guy's wrapper hasn't seen daylight in probably 130 years at this point, or more than that. And here he is going on a run again. So that historical aspect was always interesting to me. And I think, as we discussed before we started recording, someone posted on Facebook recently where the term buff came from. And that's kind of interesting, that the buffs, the original men who were interested in watching firefighting, were around the 1870s or thereabouts, and they would wear these buffalo coats to make them large and intimidating. And the reason they were doing that is, in 1865, the volunteer service ended in New York City. They introduced a paid department, and there was a lot of conflict between the two of them. So the buffs would put on these big buffalo coats to try to protect the newly established paid department. So, that whole aspect of historical firefighting, you could probably dig up in many departments, many of the urban departments, but maybe in some of the newer areas, it might be, not quite as clear. And I thought that might be of interest to me. I found it personally kind of fascinating.
Yeah, and you have a chapter in the book just based on buffs alone, of the interesting people, and you get a lot of them that would come to ride along with your company when you were out there.
Well, that used to be the case. What happened was, prior to 9/11, buffs would ride fairly frequently. There were some guys out there that were very interested, and they fit in very well in the firehouse. They would sit down and converse and have the meal with us, and often they would ride on the rig. Then 9/11 came along, and right after that, because of the obvious dangers of who knows what's going to happen in New York City, they no longer allowed buffs officially to ride. Now, what is it like today? Could I say with 100% certainty that there are no more buffs riding? I couldn't say that. It probably comes down to an individual decision in a particular firehouse, whether or not the officer would want that or not. But yeah, I had buffs ride with me once or twice. I had sons of firefighters ride with me. And looking back on it, I'd have to say, we were kind of fortunate because no one ever got hurt. And if you think, again, we talked about 9/11, that morning, the number of companies that came to Lower Manhattan, geez, I don't even want to think about what would have happened if a buff happened to take in a run that morning. It could have been disastrous for them. So yeah, I knew a number of buffs. They were always very supportive of us, usually pretty decent people. Some of them were, a little bit neurotic in certain ways, but they were nice to have around the firehouse. There were one or two or three in particular I can think of that fit in very well. One of them, when I was a firefighter in mid-Manhattan in 24 truck, there was a fellow named Matty who had, he was probably in his mid-80s, and he had been riding with or hanging out in that company since they had horses. That's how old he was. And it was like having a grandfather around the firehouse. He was a great old guy. Every evening he would walk down the street from the hotel where he lived and have dinner with us. But yeah, the buffs, I assume they're throughout the fire service, but they are definitely an institution in New York City.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it was kind of cool to read that chapter where you're describing how the buffs would operate and flow through, and it's pretty cool. So obviously, a lot of times if I bring on somebody over here from FDNY, there's always the World Trade Center topic. But even before that, were you on the bombing in '93?
No, I actually was home that day.
Okay.
I remember watching that on TV. I clearly remember watching that and my jaw dropping. And what's strange about that is their intent that day was to set off a bomb to destroy just enough columns to cause that building to fall down. And all of us, including me, looked at it like, what, are you kidding me? That would never happen. It was inconceivable that something like that could happen. And obviously, years later, the peculiar construction of those two buildings was different from any other construction in New York City, and basically, was why the disaster was as bad as it was.
Yeah. I just recently got to do an episode of Firefighters and Fire Trucks Getting Ice Cream with Sean Gray outside of Atlanta. And it was kind of cool because we were using an engine from the Terry Farrell Fund. And it was an old FDNY, actually maxi pumper, that it was in service, an old France that was in service from 85 to 93. And one of its last runs was the WTC bombing. And
Oh,
there's like a picture of the maxi pumper in front of the World Trade Center, and
yeah.
just so cool. Like so you being in the history of that and seeing it, I felt like I'm like, this is a piece of FDNY history that I can actually sit in and kind of drive around it for a little while. And it's an experience you just don't get every day.
That is pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, even the sad thing is, like, you have the chapter going down with the fire poles. I work in California. We don't have very many 2-story fire stations.
Yeah.
I just recently got to slide down a fire pole not too long ago, and I've been doing this a long time. So we take certain things for granted. I don't think we do. Everybody has that.
Was that the first time you slid down a pole?
Yeah, just like 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's only because a larger fire department recently took my fire department over. So now I'm with San Bernardino County Fire Department, and it was a fire station up in the mountain battalions that actually, because it's a mountain station, they had to build it up because there's not a lot of room. And I got to slide down a pole. It's just, it's probably an everyday occurrence for you.
You have to admit, it's a pretty cool experience. It really is.
Just like in your book, you first look down, and it's not like it's just a one story. You're going down that full height of that apparatus bay. It's quite far down when you look at it the first time.
There's a company in the Lower East Side, I think it's 33 Engine. I worked there very briefly as I think I was a captain, and I was there for a day, and it has the tallest ceilings in any firehouse in New York City. And you look down this pole and it's like, wow, that's a long way to go. I guess when it was built in the 19th century, that's just how they built the buildings. But yeah, that was one of those things that, you know, in era, I made the assumption that every firefighter knew about poles, but yeah, there are many stations out there outside of New York that are one-story structures, and probably there are guys out there who haven't experienced that. But I always liked it. It was just like, you kind of felt like Batman. You'd get on the top floor. And I remember I mentioned in the book, the first time I did it, I had visited my father's firehouse in Brooklyn. And he said, why don't you slide the pole? And I'm probably about 10 or something, 9, 10 years old. And I get to the second floor and I look down the hole. There's my father down there. And a little scary, but then I slid down. I thought, wow, this is a great experience. And he gets paid to do this, you know. But I just thought it was kind of something I wanted to, you know, include in the book, because it's almost taken for granted in New York City. It's just like you virtually do it in your sleep, you know. And even as a deputy, when I got to that rank, you know, I'm the guy, the incident commander. It's not that vital that I get there as fast as the engine or as fast as the first battalion chief. And I had the option of walking down the stairs, which I usually did. But there were times, just for the hell of it, you know, if they rang the dinner bell, you know, I'd slide the pole. It was like, it was quicker, it was fun. And it is, you know, when you think about the fire service as a kid, two of the things that come to mind are the pole and the Dalmatian. So it's really an inherent part of at least New York City and urban firefighter culture.
Yeah, well, like you described in the book, you don't see like a person that works in a tax office sliding down the pole to get down to the other floor. And
Yeah.
so it really is cool. I enjoyed reading that chapter. Like I said, you're a really good wordsmith as far as the way that you kind of like lay down the foundation, and just, you know, you would think like there's an entire chapter on just the fire pole, but it's really really well written, and it's a fun read. So so obviously there's a ton of stuff that you can talk about with when you promoted to lieutenant, and you talk about your learning experience as you kind of walk through into that leadership role. So a lot of the people that are usually on the Firefighter Book Club are either already officers or aspiring to be officers. So what's some of the takeaways that you can give us? And like, okay, I just got promoted to lieutenant, and now I'm kind of being, like you said, the supervisor the following day. One day I'm a firefighter riding back step, and the next day I'm riding the front seat.
I would say it is a huge step. It was a huge step for me. I think the two biggest steps, mentally and even emotionally, you're going to make in the fire service in your career, if you choose to do so, is that step from firefighter to company officer. And eventually, if you choose to pursue becoming a chief, that step from being a company officer to a chief. It was a real challenge for me. It was not an easy transition. When I got promoted, I had 6 years on the job, and I had worked in engines and trucks. I had seen a lot of fire duty, so I had a pretty good overall fire background. That being said, 6 years is not a huge amount of time, especially in an urban department like the FDNY. So I remember very clearly the Sunday afternoon prior to what was going to be my first night tour as a lieutenant, as a new company officer in an engine company in Brooklyn. And I was a nervous wreck. And fortunately, what I found throughout my career, for the most part, 99% of the veterans on the job bent over backwards to help me to make that transition. You know, very, very few people gave me any problems at all. I think, at least initially, they could sense how green I was, and they extended themselves to me. So people who are going through this transition, whatever department you're in, or anticipating at some point getting promoted, going through that transition, I would say a couple of things. First of all, If you're nervous about it, don't worry. It means that's a normal feeling. You're human. You're a human being. If you go from the back step to the front step, accept the fact that you're making a huge change and you're going to be uncomfortable, and that's all right. You can anticipate that you're not going to be comfortable, but most of your personnel are going to extend themselves to you. Have confidence in yourself, all right, in the sense that they didn't just make me a lieutenant all of a sudden, a company officer overnight. I did go to a lot of fires. I did go to a lot of incidents. I did the truck work. I did the engine work. Recognize the fact that they didn't just pluck a civilian out and make him a company officer. They took a firefighter who's been through training, who's been through some experience. So have that confidence in yourself. And the other thing I always felt was be yourself. All right. If you're gregarious, be gregarious. If you're quiet, be quiet. Don't try to become someone else. Don't try to live up to an image of what you think in the company officer is or should be, or how they should come across. Be yourself, because firefighters will cut right through the BS. They'll know if you're being honest and being who you are, or if you're trying to act up something. And I think they will accept and respect you as you are if you show the confidence in being who you are. All right. So yeah, I'm a big mouth, or I'm a quiet guy, or whatever I am, but that's who I am. And I'm coming here with a certain level of background. And, maybe I'm not the best company officer yet. Maybe I'm not the best chief officer yet, but I can come with a certain level of ability. I feel I could do this job, and be honest with yourself, and be good to the guys. That's a general rule. Guys or women, whoever you happen to be working with or supervising, keep them in mind. Realize where you came from. I never wanted to get rid of where I came from. In terms of, one of the things I always liked about the fire service is that no one's born a deputy chief or a battalion chief. You come in as the grunt, all right, as the low man on the totem pole, or low woman on the totem pole, and you get an appreciation for how physically challenging and how difficult this job is. So when you bring that along with you as you go through the ranks, maybe from company officer to, let's say, battalion chief, you recognize what your people or your personnel are going through, and you realize that there are limits as to what they can do and what their needs might be in terms of relief or refreshment or just encouragement. So those are just some of the, having been fortunate to jump through a number of ranks in the FDNY, these were some of the things that I found were very helpful to me in easing into each rank. And again, I'd have to say, probably each promotion and each rank, the transition was a difficult one. I was not as nervous later on in my career, but it was not always an easy transition. I had to learn day by day, month by month. And that's essentially some of the things I would emphasize. And I'm going to plug my laptop in because my battery's low, but I
Yeah. Well, and another one, like you talked about, be yourself. You talk, kind of like act like you've been there before. Don't look nervous, even if you are nervous. But the other one that I really took away, which I really want to have you send out there, is having the ability to say no. And I think that's crucial. Is you're the company officer. You got to know when, yeah, no, we're not doing that, or yeah, that joke's not funny. Like. You have to know when to say no. So can you kind of discuss some of those things, like as an officer, how you've had to manage that?
Yeah, that's something like you're no longer one of the boys, all right? You're no longer the backstep person, you're up front. And there are going to be instances where there will be requests or perhaps expectations where it's rubbing you the wrong way. And just as when you run a fire, I think you get a sense in your gut if things are going well or if things just don't feel right. And in personnel management, day-to-day management of individuals, whether it's in the fire department or another type of job, I think you will know when something's bugging you inside. If a situation or a request just doesn't feel right. Let's say, as one specific example, as a relatively new lieutenant, as company officer, I was working in a truck company in the northern section of the Bronx. And the Bronx borders Yonkers, right? It's a different city. And one of the firefighters who was doing some work on his house, whatever, he wanted to go up to the Home Depot, which was just on the other side of the border, because he needed fittings or screws, whatever it was he needed for this project. And he comes in the office, and maybe he saw me as a mark because I was a new guy. Hey, Lou, is it okay if we take the rig up to Home Depot? And normally my answer would be, yeah, let's go, let's do it, because all Home Depot's in the Bronx, right? Well, it turns out Home Depot's not in the Bronx. And I find out, well, where is it? It's on whatever avenue. Wait a minute, isn't that over the border? Isn't that in Yonkers itself? Yeah, but it's just a few blocks. And even as a new guy, I had to say, I can't do that. Think about the position you're putting me in. I go 2 blocks into Yonkers. We park the rig. You go in and get your box of sheetrock screws or whatever the heck it is you want. And as we're pulling out of that spot, we get in an accident. All right. How am I going to tell headquarters, hey, yeah, listen, I'm in an accident. All right, where are you? I'm in Yonkers. You know, it would not fly well for me as an officer. So there are instances like that. Once in a long while, and this was rather rare, but once in a while, I might have a firefighter come into work, let's say not in a physical frame of mind to work that day for some reason. And again, you have to step up and say, hey, either you're part of this company today or you're going sick right now. There are times, as much as you want to relate to the people and show them that you're there for you and there for them and you will support them, there are times when I think you have to step up and be a little bit of a hard ass as a company officer. And that's not always easy to do, because we all want to be people pleasers. That's part of being human nature. So there were instances like that where even as a new officer, I was in position to say no. It got easier over time, because I think what happens is, as you get more time in a rank, you evolve into a different person, and they almost view you a little differently. So they're not going to ask a very experienced guy the same request that they're going to give to a brand new guy. But that is another part of that transition from becoming an employee, a worker, to a supervisor, that the realization that your responsibilities have changed quite a bit, and you're not, as I say, not one of the boys. There's times when you're gonna have to step back and say, no, we can't, we're not doing that, and it's non-negotiable. It's true on the Fireground. All right, I found this a lot as a chief, and perhaps you've experienced this, where as a chief officer running a fire operation from the street, you get that gut feeling like, this ain't going well. We've been pushing a 2.5-inch line in there for about 10, 11 minutes, and there's still a large volume of fire, and I don't know about the structure. I'm taking everyone out. We're transitioning to an exterior operation. And most of the time, the guys will get out right away. But once in a while, you'll get that report from the guy inside the building. He's got the face piece on, you can hardly hear him. Hey, Chief, we're making progress. Well, not from my perspective, you're not. It's a clear no, we're going outside. So there are instances in all the ranks, starting from company officer right up to the deputy chief, where you had to stay true to yourself and true to your instincts and say, no, this ain't a democracy. This is a quasi-military structure, and for right now, I'm at the top of that structure, and this is the way it's going to be.
Yeah. No, it's good. It lines up with a lot of stuff that my new book is going to talk about. So I'm really excited. I always love hearing stories like that, especially in in an organization that had a culture that could push the limits for sure with your department on that stuff. Uh, uh,
I have to say
so
the
one of the other chapters.
department, I was going to say briefly, the department I entered in 1981 is a radically different department than the one you have today. The culture was entirely different back then. And I think the changes are mostly for the good.
Yeah.
New York, you're right. New York had its own peculiarities at some points.
Right. Well, even I had never heard the term square rooter before. That's that's a pretty good one. I'm going to try to get that started in California and see how well that'll take off. It's like, oh yeah, he's the guy that's trying to work all the angles. In the book, like I have a guy that's like, it would be a square rooter for you, but because I'm applying the Fireground tactics and strategy to human fires, I call this individual a target hazard. I said he's well fortified. He actually has a very strong building construction, and he's going to be very difficult for any company officer to manage if he's actually on fire. So, and he's really proud to say it, like, like his name's not mentioned in the book, but like whenever like it comes up, he's like, oh yeah, I'm Jesse's biggest target hazard. Like great. Yeah, but it's always good stuff.
I'm sure you changed the names in your book when you wrote about individuals.
Well, just like you wrote in yours, you have to protect the innocent and the guilty. So yeah, you have to change the names.
And to keep yourself from getting sued for that matter.
Right.
I'd have to say every incident in that book and every character in that book is a real incident and a real character. And obviously, some of the individuals are portrayed in a very positive way, because most of my experiences were positive. But yeah, naturally, we changed the names of to protect the innocent.
Right. So the last chapter I want to discuss with you, and it's kind of one that kind of squeezed in there. You're talking about all these stories about you in the fire department, and then you kind of talk about a story of you as a writer, and then you as a presenter out on the conference circuit. And a lot of times, again, people that are on the Firefighter Book Club, we always want to like, hey, let's review the book. Let's talk about some stuff in the book. And then we always talk about at the end, let's talk about some writing stuff too, because a lot of them are aspiring authors. Well, most of them that are aspiring authors and want to do a book are also trying to figure out the unknowns of being on the circuit. And it's a ebb and flow. You put in for conferences, you get denied, you get accepted, you go back and forth, and but figuring out the conference circuit is a whole nother fire service hidden secret, if you will. But if there's something you could talk about, like, hey, what it's like for those that are looking to do that, and travel and go out there and teach like me and you do, what's some of the stuff that you give on the insight?
Well, I'd say, first of all, if you're thinking about doing it, because I know one or two individuals who are firefighters, not in the FDNY, but in local communities, have mentioned to me the interest in doing it. I would say, if you're interested, go for it. All right, do not hesitate. Don't be intimidated by the industry. Don't think that your message isn't worth telling. So the first thing would be, go for it and try to do it. Try to find a topic that, first of all, something about, because you can't really fake your way through these things. And if at all possible, if you can somehow narrow it down to a topic that is unusual or peculiar, or maybe takes a different slant on something. Perhaps you're an expert on hydrants or foam or forcible entry. There's a lot of forcible entry stuff going on out there. But try to focus, if you can, on one individual type of thing. Develop a PowerPoint, but don't make the mistake of leaning on that PowerPoint. You're not building a PowerPoint, you're building a speaker. You're building a presenter who will stand in front of a room of anywhere from a dozen to 300 people, who will be focusing on you, not your bullet lines on a PowerPoint. You certainly, the great, I've had the opportunity to do the bigger ones, FDIC, Expo, all those things, and those are great. and by all means, put in for them, but don't be afraid to start, if you want to call it the minor leagues. Approach your local volunteer department. Don't worry, don't ask for money. Just develop your craft and develop your individual presentation by giving it to the local volunteer fire department, maybe approaching the county fire training facilities. They might be receptive to new ideas. I found that the more I did something, the better I got at it and the more refined my product was. My very first presentation was a PowerPoint in black and white, which was boring to begin with, at a local fire academy, county fire academy. And it was entirely too long. And I had to rattle on and on to get through it. And you'll find that over time, you'll get better, you'll get more confident, and you'll need fewer and fewer slides because you'll engage more deeply in each individual slide, which will hopefully draw out individuals in the audience. And I always love when one guy steps up in the rear and sees a slide and wants to tell us a story about his experience, which is similar to that slide. And then maybe a guy in front steps up and say, that's BS, that's what you said is completely wrong because I experienced something different. And you get these sort of interactions. So those are some of the things that I would throw out as possible guides to people, and realize that, again, it's a little bit like that transition from backstep to front seat as an officer. If you're used to sitting in the classroom and are not used to sitting up front addressing people, be yourself. Don't try to be the John Norman or John Sulker or Vinnie Dunn. Just be yourself and relate to the people as you normally would.
Yeah, well, that's great stuff, Chief. And hopefully I'll see you on the circuit soon. It seems like we keep crossing paths without touching each other, but I really appreciate you being on here today.
Thank you.
And look, hopefully if you haven't read this book, it's definitely one that should be on your reading list. And I got a couple more chapters to go.
Again, just to mention, if anyone is interested, I intended this book as a sort of lighter read and an alternative to the many great technical books that are out there. As I said, in this fall or no later than next spring, I have a fire-related novel coming out called A Moment in Time. And when it is released, I'll announce it on Facebook. So hopefully, maybe one or two people might be curious about that. But again, really my thanks to you, Jesse, and to anyone tuning in today or in the future for having me on the show here. It's certainly an honor to be asked to be part of it, and I very much appreciate it and enjoyed it.